We're going to have to invent this as we go along now, but the main thought was we'd have some questions among ourselves, a couple of questions anyway to get it rolling, and then we wanted to invite all of you to ask questions that you may have. Looks like we have about 15 minutes. I'm going to try to bring this mic to anybody. Could anybody have a question they'd like to ask? I'll have you ask it with the mic. I see one back here first. Jim Graceffa.
Thanks, Dave. It was mentioned that prior to the Classic period, ceramic production was in isolated areas and then traded, and then during the Classic period, households started making their pottery. Is there a reason for that? Can anyone answer that?
Well, obviously the argument that I made about the marketplaces is that those marketplaces were associated with the ball courts. And so when the ball court festivities were going on, that's when the marketplaces were set up. And so obviously this very highly sophisticated division of labor and distribution is dependent on this marketplace kind of argument. And we know now that, or many of us believe, that the ball court network falls apart very rapidly at around 1070. And so that mechanism for distribution obviously must have had an important impact on the nature of production. And so it's at that point where this very reliable, very efficient mechanism for moving pots around disappears. And it may be at that time that people realize that they have to start making their own pots.
I have a somewhat different take on it. Harold, in the Gila Valley, the Adamsville site is the type site for the early Classic period. There's a ball court there that's thought to date to the early 1100s. David Gregory, in a study with Fred Niles, showed that the early platform mounds also have a spatial relationship with ball courts that's regular. And so they argue that they persist into the early Classic period. Up here in the Flagstaff area, we also have ball courts that look like they go into the late 1100s anyway, and in the Verde Valley. And so I'm not persuaded that ball courts go away quite so rapidly as Dave has argued. However, at the beginning of the Classic period, we also see some other changes. What Henry calls Style 2 drops out. We have redware pottery becomes very prevalent. Many of those religious belief systems that Henry has talked about seem to go away in favor of a new kind of religious ideology. Dave Doyle has talked about that as well. And there's also a shift in the demography where the Gila Valley seems to have been quite demographically dominant in the time of Snaketown, which is abandoned by about 1070 or 1100, as are many other sites in the Gila Valley at that time, plaza-centered sites, Gregory showed. There's a great rise of population in the Salt River Valley. The lower Verde Valley clears out. It looks like they moved into the lower Salt, and the Salt then becomes dominant just at the time that the platform mounds you've heard something about today became more and more significant as central features in many of these villages. And so I think that it's a much more complex process that's going on there. Changes in ideology, changes in economic organization, but does it mean that they balkanized into individual irrigation communities, macro irrigation communities, or were there new forms of integration across the whole valley, which is the kind of thing I think is true. The real trick then is how do we test these different alternatives? So.
Obviously we need to. Next question?
You mentioned the changes happened about the 1800s. Was this the 800s going on with the Chacoan and Membres culture at the same time? And was salinity ever a factor in the changing culture of the Salt River Valley? Salinity, because it's called the Salt River, and I recall that salt buildup was a problem later with agriculture.
Okay, I'll address the first part of that. yes, there are changes elsewhere that occur, but they're not entirely synchronous. And Membrace, what happens at 800 with Hohokam definitely shows up in the Membrace area at sort of a reduced and modified level. There's sort of like, it's almost like you're on the fringe of something that's going on, because there's some iconography that you can see on the early styles of Membrace pottery that have similarities to what you see in style 2. And there are other things as well. They get the palettes. There's some ritual closing ceremonies that where artifacts are broken as part of it that have similarities to what happens in the Hohokam area. But that only lasts for a fairly short time there, and then they sort of go their own way. You don't see that same sort of thing anywhere else, to my knowledge. It's different elsewhere. So it's really just Hohokam and Membrace that are in step that way. And for your second one, you're the one.
Yeah, in terms of salinity, I can make a few comments. The term salt river really is a misnomer. When we look at the parts per million of salts, it's really not that great. It gets very complex. A lot of people have suggested salinity as a part of what caused the Hohokam collapse. But there are also different types of salt. There are some black alkalis that come down the Verde River, and they're much more damaging to crops than other types of salts. With the Salt River, with the Phoenix Basin, our sediments are pretty porous. And we're able to put large amounts of water on the ground surface and have that percolate down very quickly. So they could do what was called flushing of the fields. And in the spring, when you have the big amount of water coming down from the melting snow and all that, getting toward a flood stage, you could take your water out of the river and you could actually flush any salts out of the soil. Salt problems develop very quickly. I mean, you're not going to be going on accumulating salts for more than 50 years. And yet the Hohokam in most of the areas were able to farm those areas for hundreds and hundreds of years. So they obviously didn't have a great problem there. Historically, there were a few patchworks of alkalinity and salinity, but it really wasn't too detrimental.
I have an origin question. It seems like either the Olmec or the Teotihuacan peoples trekked up and settled in, or the ideas diffused from Mesoamerica and the indigenous archaic people reassembled them and created their culture. I would like to know where you all are on the origins of the Hohokam.
I want to start. I once wrote a paper about the history of the discussion of that question of Mesoamerican Southwest relationships. And recently I've published a later paper, thank you, a later paper that is a new review paper of that same issue. It's very complicated, and a fundamental problem is that in northern Mexico, we still know very, very, very little. So there's a big gap in our knowledge, literally. And so it's a good opportunity for lots of speculation. Now, Teotihuacan, you mentioned. Teotihuacan is in the Valley of Mexico. It was a city of maybe 200,000 people, some people say, in the early centuries AD. It doesn't look like it had anything directly to do with the American South, what today we call the American Southwest. What we do find in Hohokam sites, was mentioned by Henry, is these pyrites-covered murebacks that are from West Mexico. And they have iconography on them that's made in a technique that's found in West Mexico. In the Tenochtitlan tradition, it's called down there. And they come in about 800 or thereabouts from there. One of them shows a naked dancer with a kilt. He has a headdress of 4 plumes. He's holding something in his hand, dancing barefoot, has a long pointed nose, which is characteristic of a lot of the iconography in West Mexico at that time on these kinds of vessels. Most of them are vessels, but they do have mirrorbacks too. And so somehow there was connectivity that created a flow of those objects from down there 1,000 miles into the American Southwest. Now, one thing to consider is that Uto-Aztecan as a language has that distribution. The Pima today, the Hopi, the Shoshone in the Great Basin, and then all the way down Tarahumara, Maya, Huichol, all speak Uto-Aztecan languages. And Hohokam, it's thought, spoke Tepiman, which is what the Piman language is. Tepehuan in North Mexico and Durango is a Tepiman language. In 1550, they were all just dialectically different. And that's a corridor from the northern end of this West Mexico area up into the American Southwest. So I early on argued that maybe that's the network along which these things could have come into the Southwest. Now, alternatively, there's a model about Panama, where you find gold objects in the prehistoric record, but they're made in Colombia. And so Mary Helms, an anthropologist, has suggested that maybe people from Panama who wanted to become shamans went down to Colombia, trained there, were given an object as a sign of the completion of that, brought that back, that gold object then back into Panama, a very rare kind of thing, just as these mirrorbacks are very rare kinds of things. Now, if they all spoke Uto-Aztecan, that might have facilitated that kind of a relationship. The problem with that, though, is that when you look at the specifics of what's known in West Mexico, and the specifics up here, they're not the same in detail. There are broad similarities, like Henry was saying, about four quarters division in pottery and things of that kind. But those ideas may go way, 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 way back, I think. I think when people first came into the Americas, their ancestors had been talking to one another for tens of thousands of years. They had a lot of ideas in their head. They had cosmologies. They already knew, I think, about the upper world and the underworld and the movement of the sun and the moon and so on. They didn't later need anybody in Mexico to tell them anything about that.
One other thing I could add to this, Dave spoke a little bit about the linguistic corridor, and he mentioned the mirrors are coming from West Mexico. There's a gap involved with some of the things that show up here, and it's a pretty big one. You have to go down to central southern Sinaloa, Durango, before you start seeing these artifacts that we're getting up here, at least in any abundance. Copper bells come in later than the mirrors, but they're also another artifact that's directly coming from West Mexico. And there's actually some pottery as well, but it's very rare. And one of the things that I think is really interesting is that, and Doc Howery pointed this out, is that there's palettes that look almost identical to Hohokam palettes as well in West Mexico. And they also don't occur north of the northernmost one that I know of that's comparable to what's up here is Guerrero and Michoacan, that area. So there's, I believe it's saying that there's contact, yes, I'm sure there's contact in the intermediate zones to some extent, but there's some sort of significant ideological, iconographic contact that's going on at this fairly long distance level, fairly direct contact. We don't know what it is.
I'm afraid we're out of time.
Oh, well. Thank Thank you all for coming.
I have a question for you, which is probably too bizarre to say out loud.
That was awesome.
Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
It was really very nice.
She wants to be an archaeologist. Get another.
It was just nice to hear about the different
nice.
kinds of things that I didn't